Well, welcome back after lunch. It's always a difficult time. So congratulations for having found your way back here, and thank you for coming. Our third session is on the social and political effects of terrorism. I'm not going to introduce the speakers because you've got a lengthy biography in front of you, which you either will or haven't read, but it's there anyway. I'll just make two very quick comments before the real people speak. I'm terribly old. Sometimes I feel older than others, but I've certainly been around for quite a long time. And I don't mean this in any disparaging way at all, but for the duration of my entire academic career, Martha has been a figure whom I've heard of, known, and respected. It's difficult to actually identify anybody who's contributed more. So we are very fortunate in having her here to speak to you today. And at the other end of the spectrum, Max Abrahams, who's not been around all that long, represents the up and coming, the new elements to things. So we're very fortunate in having as our speakers the two ends of a potential spectrum. And without more ado, I'll introduce Martha to you.
Well, thank you for that very flattering introduction. It's true that I have been around for a long time. I was around when this center was first created, so I'm especially pleased to be invited to the 25th anniversary celebration. It's been a great success, and I've known all the directors, and it's just an impressive record. So our topic today is the political and social effects of terrorism. And so I think I'm going to take an approach that may be a little bit different. Certainly it's different from approaches that I've taken before. And let me say as a preface before I start that what I'm talking about is transnational terrorism, by which we generally mean in the contemporary world jihadist terrorism. And by that, I mean nothing more than acts of violence perpetrated by Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State, Daesh, or like-minded groups. And I'm not going to go further into that sort of terminology other than to limit the scope of my remarks to that particular form of transnational terrorism. Now, the argument that I want to make is that the effects and the effectiveness of this type of terrorism cannot be understood or explained by focusing on terrorism alone. And here, I think perhaps this is a word to researchers. It echoes some of the things we heard earlier today, which is that considering terrorism in isolation from other events, phenomena, activity, forms of violence, responses by the state, is too narrow. It's simply too narrow an approach to the subject. So what I want to talk about is the relationship between transnational terrorism, civil war, and foreign military intervention. And the argument I'm going to make is that if we're going to consider the effects of terrorism today, we have to consider it in that context. Now, my time is short, so I'm going to be very condensed. I hope I won't be too cryptic as I present this, but here's an outline, a roadmap of what I'm going to argue. I'm going to make three basic arguments. One has to do with the power of the ideological narrative, which we talked a lot this morning about social media. I'm talking about the content of the message that is transmitted via social media and mass media for that matter. I'm talking about the material resources behind terrorism, which are part of the reasons for the success of terrorism, if we regard it as successful, certainly one of the reasons for its impact. And I'm going to talk about the way in which terrorism has been able to spread around the world, its expansion, its contagion from a very small number of locales to now very much a worldwide phenomenon. And then I want to raise two questions. One of these has to do with the outcomes of civil wars, and that is, do extremists win? Now, this is a question that's been debated. My colleague Max Abrahams has weighed in on this, and I want to raise it as a question. The second question I want to raise also has to do with something we talked about this morning, and that is there an inevitable sort of conflict spiral in that terrorism provokes intervention, intervention provokes more terrorism, there's thus more intervention in order to prevent terrorism, which started it, it becomes very difficult to know, but is there this sort of interlocking conflict spiral that's very hard to break? Is it inevitable? So let me talk first about the information war. Most students now of conflict in the contemporary world talk about hybrid warfare, the gray zone, information war. The RAND Corporation has a recent report about modern political warfare, and one of the many interesting things about the report is that they talk about state as well as non-state actors in the same terms. So Iran, China, ISIS, all are practicing this form of warfare. And I think that's rather interesting because in earlier studies of conflict, we would not have put states and non-states probably in the same basket as actors. But now when we talk about warfare, we see non-states as being not the equivalent of states, of course, but able to compete with states in very many ways. Now, government approaches to the problem of the information war typically focus on how the message is transmitted, the ideological narrative, and through what means, and then the receptivity of the audience to the message. We heard some of that this morning. How can we restrict social media? Can we control what Facebook does, Twitter, all the various organs associated with the social media? Should we try to control access to that form of communication on the part of violent non-state actors, be it the far right, be it Islamist extremists, be it whoever we wish to ban from access to means of communication? Do we just cut them off from the means? Do we shut down their website? Do we shut down their Twitter accounts, shut down their Facebook accounts? Would this be the way to go about it? And that's obviously a subject of fairly controversial sorts of debate, certainly in the United States. The other side of this approach is the counter-radicalization sorts of approaches. And that's the idea that the way you would deal with this problem is to deal with the audience for the message. You make them more resilient to the message. You teach them that this is a false message. You try to prevent. We deal a lot preventing violent extremism. A large part of that is trying to educate audiences, identify who might be the most vulnerable, for example. I think we're all familiar with this. And what I see as the missing part of the puzzle is the reality on which the message is based, that is the content of the ideological narrative. And I would argue to you that the ideological narrative would not have the power and influence that it does were not for the fact that it's rooted in a reality of civil war, civil conflict, and military intervention. Taking terrorism out of that context, I think, makes it hard for us to understand why there would be a power behind the narrative, why it would be compelling, why it would be credible, why calling for violence would appear to be legitimate, why the call to violence would appear to be something urgent and immediate. And I'm sure most of you are very familiar with a lot of the themes and tropes in these narratives. And let me say parenthetically that in sort of saying there is a narrative, I'm not lumping all the different factions and interests within the larger movement together. I know that there are very important differences and differences in the message, but I don't have time to go into all the details now. So for the sake of brevity, I'm lumping them together in a way that most of us scholars don't really like to do. But one of the themes, of course, is defense of Muslims against hostility and aggression from the West, and it's buttressed by invasions of Iraq, which we talked about this morning, the presence of Western military forces in civil conflicts around the world, drone warfare. If my argument would be that this is not to blame the activities of Western powers, but simply to say that I don't think the narrative would have the power that it does. There really are civil wars in which Muslims are fighting non-Muslims. And this narrative got its start not after 9/11, but in Bosnia and Chechnya and in Afghanistan before that. So this is a very old theme. So I'm saying look at the reality of intervention, look at the event, and then perhaps we need to add to it controlling how the message is transmitted and the receptivity of the audience to the message. But we should look at the fact that there is a reality to the message. There have been some recent studies, in fact one by our colleague Clark Macaulay, surveying attitudes of Muslim youth, mostly in Europe, and his anger at Western foreign policies that was driving a lot of the support for the use of violence. And I myself have talked, for example, to some of the high school students from Molenbeek in Belgium, and I will say that they objected strongly to a lecture that I gave talking about the history of the study of the psychology of terrorism, because they said it's nothing to do with psychology, it has to do with Western aggression in Africa and in Asia. So this is a perception that is very strong, but there is a basis of it in reality, and I think we've not always confronted that. Two of the consequences, of course, are the activation of what we now call homegrown terrorism, inspirational sorts of terrorism, appealing to people to attack at home, and of course the foreign fighter problem, which is an enormous problem for, particularly for European governments, less so for the U.S. The U.S., of course, is urging its European allies to repatriate foreign fighters, and the U.S. actually has very few foreign fighters to worry about itself. But these are enormous issues. You wouldn't have foreign fighters if there weren't civil wars to go fight in, after all. So we don't want to leave aside this part of it and to see it simply as a problem of terrorism. These are returning terrorist fighters. They did go to fight in wars. Furthermore, regardless of what happens in the conflict that people originally went to fight in, once they become veterans, it's highly likely that they're just going to migrate to other conflicts rather than give it up or go home to be repatriated and tried. They tend to migrate to other conflicts. They aren't exactly mercenaries, but they are mobile, and there are many, many, many likely conflicts around the world. If you just look, how many that if you wanted to volunteer to fight to defend Muslims against infidels, you would find a large number of conflicts. So let me turn now to the material side, because it's not just about ideology alone. A lot of studies of information war, et cetera, gray zone, but more information war sorts of literature tends to downplay, at best, the material, the kinetic side of conflict. Now, most studies of terrorism over the years have said it was the weapon of the weak, that it didn't require very many resources, that it was cheap and easy and economical. I have said this myself. And compared to other forms of using violence, it's less costly. It requires less in the way of resources, but it requires some resources. It doesn't require no resources. If it didn't require any resources, we wouldn't see Western governments, the UN, the EU, NATO, trying to restrict terrorist financing. It's been a major issue of Western governments for quite some time. So there is an important material side to it. And one of the material assets that is the effectiveness of which is extremely debated is safe havens. So do these transnational terrorist entities need safe havens, territorial havens, in a modern world of drone warfare when leaders can be picked off wherever they might happen to be practically, not everywhere, but in lots of different places? Is there any safety in a safe haven anymore? Is there any such thing as sanctuary? They are costly. Once you occupy territory, you make yourself a target. You have a fixed address. On the other hand, we know that safe havens are still an important issue. This is one of the main barriers to negotiation between the U.S. and the Taliban. Whether or not the Taliban could credibly guarantee not to provide a safe haven for al-Qaeda once the negotiations are concluded and the Taliban takes over in Afghanistan, which in my view is what's likely to happen, could they issue this kind of credible commitment not to allow al-Qaeda back in? And of course, that issue didn't get resolved before the President of the United States called off the negotiations abruptly, so we really don't know how that would have worked out. But I think that indicates that safe havens are still regarded as something that is important. If they are important, and again, I'm saying they have both costs and benefits, it's not as though they're an unalloyed asset for a non-state actor. If they are of value to a non-state actor, are civil wars propitious for establishing safe havens, or do such groups prefer states that are extremely weak and that have ungoverned spaces, but where there's not so much fighting that it's sort of dangerous to try to put yourself there, or where you might be in the U.S. crosshairs, so to speak, with drone strikes? This is still very much, I would say, an open sort of question. It's something that actually, if people are looking for a research topic, I think that would make a pretty good research topic. So it's, the answer is really not definitive, but let me just add on that subject that it's not just the material side and territory, because if you look at establishing the caliphate, it was an important ideological advantage as well as a material advantage. And note here that control of territory in an expanded civil war situation also gave ISIS access to very important financial resources through oil, through looting, through taxes, through seizing the assets of banks in Mosul, for example. So it both gave you haven, so to speak, as well as access to resources that can be very important. Indicating that weapons and money are still really very important to these groups. If you look at Northern Africa and look at the Sahel region and you look at kidnapping for ransom, you see that a practice of looting, kidnapping, and other forms of, in effect, criminal activity that are money-raising sorts of activities, I would argue, are made easier in a civil war sort of situation where borders are unprotected, where it's easy to engage in criminal behavior because there's simply no means of regulating such behavior. It's been said that al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb raised something like several $1 million from kidnapping hostages, mostly European hostages in the region. It's an important source of income. Smuggling, the one-time head of AQIM, Bel Mokhtar, was known as Mr. Marlboro because he made a lot of money out of cigarette smuggling. And that sounds amusing, but it was an important source of funding for transnational terrorism, exactly. So access to resources is important, and so I'm suggesting that in cases, particularly where there's a lot of civil conflict, and also where there are foreign armies, helps provide access to resources for these groups. Now that point leads me, I hope logically to me, to the third point I wanted to make here about the expansion of transnational terrorist networks worldwide. And let me just start by quoting a Norwegian researcher I was reading recently about Chechnya. And she said, money buys ideas. And what she was talking about was how in the 1990s, the Chechen struggle started as largely a nationalist, separatist, perhaps ethnic conflict against the formerly Soviet Union, now Russia. Chechnya wanted independence for historical reasons that were pretty compelling to a lot of people. Now, there was an Islamist element within the Chechen resistance, but it was not the dominant strain within the resistance, and it was not an extreme or jihadist form of Islamism. And of course, they succeeded somewhat against the Russians, but increasingly they needed access to outside resources to be able to continue the struggle, and the supplier of outside resources of money, weapons, foreign fighters, of course, is a transnational jihadist network. And of course, the question of where they get their money is something that we all puzzle on quite a lot. There are a number of different sources. But once you turn to that source for your weapons and your money and your fighters, then you're beholden to them in many ways. And again, ideas then follow the money, and Chechnya now became the emirate of the Caucasus Emirate. They expanded their ambitions to Dagestan. They provoked the Russians. It permitted the Russians to claim that they were now supporting everybody else in the war on terror. This is all part of the global war on terrorism. The result was a pretty bad defeat for the Chechens and, of course, enormous killing, murder, destruction. There are many similar examples. Mali is another one where what were essentially local struggles, ethnic, whatever local grievances having to do often with economics, with grievances, often with the neglect by the center of peripheral regions of a country, all sorts of local causes. And I'm aware that a lot of students of Civil War now dismiss the idea that grievances have anything to do with it. But I think grievances do have a lot to do with it. And local grievances then become allied with the global jihadist cause. Again, Mali and the Sahel being a very good example where, you know, what began in Mali was largely, in northern Mali, it was largely a Tuareg revolt that had been going on for many years. Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb defeated in Algeria across the border, which shows you, of course, that military defeat of one of these groups, it can be done. I think it was done in Algeria, and what happened was that they moved across the border into Mali. In any sort of region with porous borders, the problem is regional, not national. You can't solve it in just one country. You have to create a Pan-Sahel task force is our latest attempt to deal with it. But basically, AQIM, Al-Qaeda, the Al-Qaeda-affiliated groups sort of flowed across the border. They formed alliances with Tuareg and other groups. In some cases, they are even said to have fomented ethnic rivalries between different groups within the region. The Islamic State has now entered the scene. And now the leader of the conglomerate that Al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb engineered the formation of is actually a Tuareg leader from way back, and he now has become an Islamist and a jihadist himself. He has apparently been converted, whether, again, it's money buying ideas or ideas buying money. We're not entirely sure. But there are numerous examples of this, and therefore the fact that you have civil wars is, and particularly where there is foreign intervention, creates opportunities for this kind of exploitation or co-optation. And I also think I would like to propose the argument that where you have the introduction of these, what are essentially outside forces, the transnational networks, makes the conflict all the more threatening to third parties. And it's threatening for at least two reasons. One, they're afraid that transnational networks will establish bases in these countries from which to attack their home countries, a realistic sort of anticipation of threat, perhaps exaggerated, but not unrealistic. And second, they fear the destabilization of weak allies who are important to them in strategic regions of the world. So they don't want either of those things to happen. Thus, I would argue that they are more tempted to intervene militarily than they would otherwise be. And you have as an example, of course, the French intervention in Mali. Furthermore, once you intervene, it is hard to get out. Hard for the US to get out, hard for France to get out. I remind governments of this from time to time, without effect, I might add. A parallel question here is whether or not, once conflicts become incorporated into the global transnational networking sort of threat, whether not only what's at stake changes in the conflict, but the kinds of tactics, methods, targets that appear in the conflicts. For example, is it more likely that civilians will be targeted, or is it more likely that military would be targeted? We don't really know what the effect is, so I think this is another subject that we should look at, but that we wouldn't think of looking at it unless we saw that this problem is that you can't really get a grip on the problem unless you look at the wider intersection of these sorts of phenomena. So again, in order to move on swiftly, let me point to my two sort of questions that I think, more questions. I've done a lot of raising of questions. So the first one is about outcomes, and it's whether or not in such conflicts, whether these are local extremists or transnational extremists, who wins in these civil wars. Is the reason the West is so concerned about Islamist influence in these civil wars that we're afraid that they will win, and thus they will create a state that will be hostile, like the Taliban in Afghanistan or like the Caliphate, which was a sort of proto-state. And there's been a lot of disagreement on this. Barbara Walter has claimed that Islamist extremists can promise better governance if they come to power. They can promise to be honest and not corrupt. Other people like Mohammed Hafez have pointed to the fact that actually the historical record shows that they don't win in most of these conflicts, Algeria being a case in point. Are foreign fighters a help or a hindrance? Yeah, you join the network, you get foreign fighters, but do they really help you out? And here, Vera Mironova, who was mentioned this morning, I think Alex Schmidt mentioned her, has done a lot of research on foreign fighters in Syria, and they're a real mixed blessing. They're not necessarily a help to you, so should you be thinking of using them in your fighting forces, there are a lot of problems. I won't go into all the details of them, but again, it's a mixed blessing. The other question here is suicide missions. If a conflict becomes part of the global nexus of conflict and becomes part of the jihadist network, are suicide missions more likely? That's not clear. Some people have found that they are more likely, but that they're more likely against military targets than civilian targets, which is sort of an interesting finding because military targets are hardened, and in order to get to the target, suicide missions will get you there more effectively than a non-suicide mission. So this is all sort of open-ended. Now, the other side here, again, I'm still on the same question of outcomes of civil wars. Civil wars end in either one side wins, the other loses, or negotiations. So now we're back to negotiations. Can you negotiate with this type of extremist, if we want to use that terminology? We don't have a good record here. We have the example of the Taliban. People have called for negotiations in Nigeria and in Somalia recently, but we really don't know much about whether or not it's possible to strike a deal with a group that is part of the global jihad. I myself have very mixed feelings on the issue, but I think it's something we need to be thinking about going forward, because I think that once you have this kind of non-state intervention in a conflict, it can be made so intractable and so difficult to resolve that there's not going to be the victory of one side or the other. So you're either going to have protracted conflict or negotiations. Then the last question I raised was about escalation dynamics. Do you have intervention, terrorism, or terrorism intervention, and then in each case it's reciprocated, and it goes on and on and on and on. This argument has been made by Emmanuel Adler as well as others. I actually did some research in this myself, and I found out that actually it's quite rare that states retaliate with military force when they're attacked by terrorists. I looked at very provocative terrorist attacks, and I found that actually it was rare because there are a lot of substitutes to the use of military force in getting at your adversary. So I have 2 minutes, so that gives me a lot of time for a conclusion by my standards. And so I'll just suggest two. One, in terms of research, and that is that at least in the kind of social science research that I'm familiar with, researchers like to see linearity. They like to see a sort of linear progression in terms of causation and in terms of effect as well. This happens, which leads to this, which leads to this. And the kind of problem I'm pointing to is extremely messy and really very difficult to deal with. It requires dealing with a lot of history, with a lot of contingency, with a lot of unknowns. But I would argue that if you just separate out one little part and try to trace it, you're simply not going to get to a very good explanation. And often it's worthwhile dealing with really messy problems because they're so important, and not to just choose a research topic because it can be dealt with with some statistical correlations, if I dare say, that sort of thing. In terms of policy, I think that my argument favors a policy of prevention, of trying to deal with civil conflicts with understanding that they're important to our security in the West, and that it would be better to try to deal with them even if they can't be solved in some big dramatic fashion, to deal with them incrementally and gradually, and not let conflicts build to the crisis point where a military intervention appears to be the only solution to the problem. That's not to say that sometimes military force isn't part of counterterrorism. It has to be part of some counterterrorism, but it shouldn't be the first resort. It should be the last resort. Thank you.
Let's see if this works here. Great. In 1971, a guy named Saul Alinsky published a book called Rules for Radicals. In his primer for the have-nots, the father of modern community organizing shared lessons he had learned over the years for successful protest. But the problem with rules for radicals is that protesters often conclude that protesting isn't enough. Historically, many groups have escalated to violence after nonviolence failed. Michael Collins, for example, concluded in the early 20th century that the Brits would continue to ignore his pleas for Irish independence unless the revolutionaries escalated with violence. Menachem Begin and other Zionist leaders reached the same conclusion in the 1940s, that the Brits would continue to occupy Palestine unless the Yishuv turned to violence. Algerian nationalists said the same thing in the 1950s, that they too turned to violence only after the French had ignored their protests to end the occupation. In the 1960s, South African activists like Nelson Mandela likewise prescribed violence after concluding that his protests alone weren't about to end the apartheid. More recently, accounts of Syrian rebels suggest many of them also picked up weapons as a last resort. The truth is that, like it or not, some radicals will become rebels, and there are rules for them too. My new book, Rules for Rebels, starts off where Rules for Radicals ends. It analyzes hundreds of militant groups from all over the world to discern why some succeed and others fail. I come with welcome news for the rebel leader. My research reveals he possesses a surprising amount of agency over his political destiny. Triumph is possible, but only if they know what to do. It turns out there's a science to victory in militant history, but even rebels must follow rules. Islamic State may come to mind when you think of a successful militant group led by a smart leader. For a while at least, its leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, was hailed as some sort of a militant genius. Now everybody here knows the basic story. He declared a caliphate in 2014, and within no time controlled land about the size of Great Britain, 1/3 of Iraq and Syria, and controlled over 9 million people. ISIS attracted the largest influx of international jihadis in history, over 40,000 foreign fighters from 110 countries, more than 4 times the number of mujahideen who had traveled to Afghanistan in the 80s to battle the Red Army. ISIS's reach was hardly limited to the caliphate. By 2016, Baghdadi had accepted the allegiance of 43 terrorist group affiliates, from Boko Haram in Nigeria to Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines. Now they were all fighting under the black banner. Not only did ISIS have territory and fighters, but it raked in over $1 billion a year in oil sales, taxes, smuggling, looting, and hostage-taking. The international media was quick to crown the ISIS leadership as masterminds. The New York Times went on and talked about the pedigree of its leadership, its military skill and terrorist techniques fuel its success. Apparently, according to The Guardian, we were dealing with highly intelligent leaders calling the shots. FT went on and said that ISIS is chillingly smart. If ever there were a smart strategic militant group, Islamic State was apparently it. This conventional wisdom in the media was fueled by think tank pundits who proclaimed ISIS leaders as strategic geniuses in three main ways. First, ISIS leaders were allegedly smart to rely so heavily on barbarism. What I mean by that is its tactic of killing as many civilians as possible. Of course, think tankers don't think that's a moral approach, but they underscored in their opinion that it was very, very strategic for the group in terms of achieving its stated goal of a caliphate, and secondarily in terms of helping organizational goals like growing its membership size. Second, according to the pundits, ISIS was very smart to decentralize, particularly to decentralize its operations and recruitment, because that's the best way to kill the most people as possible. So whereas the first thing is the civilian carnage, the second thing they pointed to, which they thought was so bright in ISIS, was its decentralized structure to maximize the civilian carnage. And the third thing that pundits pointed to was ISIS's PR strategy of cultivating the baddest reputation possible. We all know how ISIS shared over social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook lurid images of, beheadings and other attacks against civilians. We read repeatedly about how ISIS's PR strategy, especially over social media, was a sign of sophistication by terrorizing the world. And yet, something unforeseen by these terrorism talking heads happened. ISIS's beloved caliphate imploded just as quickly as it had appeared. Think tank pundits had been too busy glorifying the group's strategy to realize it was a bust. From the moment Baghdadi declared a caliphate in 2014, it was obvious to me that actually he was no mastermind, and neither were his fellow strategists. They were, as you'll see, supremely stupid terrorists. President Obama got hammered in the media for saying early on that ISIS was the JV team of terrorists, but he was right, at least when it comes to devising a winning political strategy. In Rules for Rebels, I demonstrate empirically that smart militant leaders follow three simple rules for victory, the exact opposite of what ISIS leaders have done. First, smart leaders recognize that not all violence is equal for achieving their stated political goals. In fact, they grasp that some attacks should be carefully avoided because they're deeply counterproductive for the cause. My research is the first to empirically demonstrate that there's variation in the political utility of attacks depending on the target. Compared to more selective violence against military and other government targets, indiscriminate violence against civilian targets is counterproductive. So the first thing that smart militant leaders do is recognize that civilian attacks are a recipe for political failure. You might say that the first rule for rebels is for members to not use terrorism at all. Now, there's no consensus, of course, over the definition of terrorism, but most scholars define it in terms of attacks against civilian targets in particular. When we talk about terrorism, most of us mean civilian attacks, like against mosques, synagogues, churches, markets, movie theaters, schools. We're certainly not talking about blowing the treads off of a tank. What matters for the rebel leader, though, isn't how we define terrorism, but that he understands the folly of harming civilians. Leaders may not initially grasp the risk of terrorism, but the smart ones learn it over time. Without internalizing this rule, they can't be expected to follow the other ones and prevail. The second rule is for the leader to actively restrain lower-level members from committing terrorism. It doesn't matter whether the leader understands the futility of terrorism if his members continue to do it. The key is for the leader to structure the organization to restrain his members from using terrorism. In practice, this means centralizing the organization so he can educate fighters to avoid civilians, punish fighters who harm civilians, and vet out prospective members who seem prone to attacking civilians. Whereas the first rule is for the leader to recognize the value of civilian restraint, the second rule is for getting his members to abide. And the third rule is what to do when they don't. For the militant leader, the key is to make the group look moderate, even when members act otherwise. This means protecting the brand by denying organizational involvement or at least intent whenever wayward operatives harm civilians. These three simple rules for rebels, learning to win, restraining to win, and denying to win, are the secrets for victory. Long before ISIS inverted this playbook, smart militant leaders were following it. They're the ones nodding their heads from parliaments, not spikes. Now, what I'd like to do now is walk you through some of the multi-method evidence undergirding each of the rules in my book. It's quite easy to make a claim about what works for rebels, but really the bulk of the book is in the evidence, some of which I'll be able to share. So I began to question the strategic value of terrorism as early as 2004, when I headed to the West Bank to do some field research during the Second Intifada. This was the height of Palestinian terrorism, and Israel was in the process of building up a massive security barrier to prevent suicide bombers from crossing into pre-1967 territory. I spent this trip talking to Israelis and Palestinians. The Israelis explained to me that they weren't always a fan of the fence, as they call it, that in the early days of the Oslo peace process, and this is substantiated by polls, the majority of Israelis were in favor of making at least some major territorial concessions to the Palestinians in exchange for peace. But with each terrorist attack, starting around 1994, there was declining Israeli interest and confidence in making territorial concessions to the Palestinians. Fast forward a decade later, and now Israel was in the process of basically unilaterally taking security measures into its own hands. Very understandably, the Palestinians I spoke to have a very different take on the wall, as they call it. They explained to me very compellingly how the wall shatters their dreams of a Palestinian state by essentially cutting into land that even a moderate Palestinian state would include. Now, one day, from the back of a cab in Hebron, I read an article from the flagship journal in political science I'd printed out the night before. In The Strategic Logic of Suicide Terrorism, Robert Pape contends in his now famous article that aggrieved groups turn to terrorism, particularly suicide terrorism, because it's the most lethal, it's the most painful, and the more costs that the aggrieved are able to inflict on the target, the greater the odds of coercing government concessions. He didn't offer a whole lot in the way of empirics, but he pointed to the case of the Palestinians and said that they were the paradigmatic example that terrorism pays. I was immediately struck by the disconnect between what I was reading and seeing on the ground. The Palestinians I met sure didn't see themselves as political winners. I couldn't help but wonder, if the Palestinians are the big political success story, then how have other groups fared that also use terrorism? This was relatively quickly after the 9/11 attacks. And so all of us were thinking a lot about 9/11, even more than we do every day. And so naturally, I revisited bin Laden's statements to see how much did he achieve relative to what he was demanding. Bin Laden, of course, had four main demands on the United States, four main grievances for why he struck. For the U.S. to withdraw from the Persian Gulf, to stop killing Muslims around the world, to sever relations with so-called apostate regimes, which are Muslim-majority countries with a pro-Western leader, particularly in Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, and to end the U.S.-Israeli special relationship. I couldn't help but notice that on all four scores, the attack backfired. The U.S. would end up increasing its troop presence in the Persian Gulf by a factor of 15. Of course, we didn't stop killing Muslims. We were just getting started, especially in the context of counterterrorism in Afghanistan and Iraq. We didn't sever relations with Saudi Arabia and Pakistan after 9/11. We actually bolstered them in the name of counterterrorism, sharing real-time intelligence, for example. The U.S.-Israeli special relationship soared at the time to unprecedented heights. You may recall the very special relationship between Sharon and Bush. Now, you might say, okay, well, here's this guy from Boston, and he's coded, 9/11 as a political failure, but isn't that a very sort of subjective determination? Well, what I would counter is that jihadists themselves, including quite important ones, from al-Suri to al-Masri, they share my perspective that from a strategic perspective, when you look at what bin Laden actually demanded, it was not only ineffective, but a strategic fiasco. Now, an interesting question is why so many people seem to think that terrorism pays with what seems like potentially a dubious political record. I've coined the term terrorist lumpers to describe those who see every attack carried out by a militant group as terrorism. This conceptual murkiness leads people to conclude that terrorism pays, even when the violence wasn't against civilians. So if you were to go to the stacks in terms of terrorism books, and you were to look at the cases, the groups and the campaigns that terrorism scholars tend to identify as big political success stories, you would see the same handful of groups that were repeated, especially the Irgun, the African National Congress, Hezbollah. But these aren't very pure examples of terrorism working, because they're all examples where the violence, at least on a dyadic level in terms of inflicting pain, was mainly directed against government / military forces rather than against civilian targets. Now, I'm not saying that they didn't attack civilians. Bruce Hoffman, I've read his excellent book, for example. I'm well aware that the Irgun also harmed civilians. But in terms of the dyadic pressure against the target, the majority of this violence was indeed against government targets. What's even more interesting to me, though, isn't what us, terrorism researchers have to say, but what the militants themselves have to say. And what I found is that the leaders of militant groups very often overrate the political value of terrorism by conflating it with successful asymmetric campaigns against government / military targets. So this right here is just one stab at this. This is a content analysis I did of Osama bin Laden's statements, where I wanted to know, according to bin Laden himself, which asymmetric campaigns did he count as political successes to reassure him that 9/11 would also have a similar coercive effect in terms of ejecting the United States out of the Persian Gulf. Every single successful campaign that bin Laden cited, hundreds and hundreds of statements, they're all actually, maybe you might call them guerrilla campaigns, in the sense that they were directed against government forces. Bin Laden is hardly alone. If you look at some of the statements by Timothy McVeigh, for example, or the Patriot Movement, when they're asked essentially why they think that militancy will prevail, they tend to cite the example of the revolutionaries in the Revolutionary War, where of course the pressure was against, the British occupiers or whatever you want to call them, not, blowing up civilians, for example, in London. If you were to read the autobiography of Susan Stern, she thought that she used to call the weather underground the Amerikong after the Viet Cong. She seemed to be thinking that her, urban activity in American cities, harming the public, was akin to the Viet Cong putting pressure on American troops. When Hamas looks in the mirror, it sees Hezbollah. Now, I began thinking, maybe there's a really big difference in terms of the political outcomes, depending on the target selection of the militants. And so in 2006, I published a paper called Why Terrorism Does Not Work, where I took a sample of foreign terrorist organizations and I disaggregated them in terms of their majority target selection since inception. And what I found is that all of the politically successful cases were when the FTO directed its violence against government targets, and the failures were when the FTO directed them against civilians. Now, I think that study does a good job of basically countering PAPE by establishing a correlation between groups that primarily rely on terrorism defined as civilian attacks and political failure. However, a counter-argument was that maybe the low political success rate of groups that attack civilians is due to their weakness. Right? Maybe their low capability is explaining their low success rate rather than their tactical choice. And indeed, all of us here have heard of the adage that terrorism is a weapon of the weak. Now, there's no question that terrorism is a weapon of the weak if you're comparing the capability of terrorists to governments. But in order to explain my results, what you'd have to be able to show is that weaker groups are more inclined to attack civilian targets rather than military, and that explains their low rate of political success. When you think about it that clearly, it doesn't make that much sense. Think about what are the strongest militant groups that come to mind over the past few decades, right? Maybe you'll think of the Islamic State or the Taliban or Al-Qaeda or the PKK or Boko Haram or Al-Shabaab. Those are the strongest militant groups. Did they shy away from harming civilians? No. In fact, they killed the lion's share. But even more scientifically, when we do a regression analysis and we disaggregate campaigns by non-state actors in terms of their target selection, in terms of when they were directed against in terms of whether they were directed against civilian targets or against military targets, and you carefully control for all sorts of factors that plausibly proxy militant group capability. For example, the membership size of the group, whether it has a state sponsor, the age of the group, all sorts of different things. What you continuously find is that terrorism, defined as civilian targeting, has a significant negative impact on the odds of government concessions. And this holds true even after carefully controlling for militant group capability. Interestingly, I found similar results in hostage settings. So all else equal, when a militant group kills a civilian compared to when a militant group kills a government target, it significantly lowers the odds of government concessions. Some of these political objectives can be a little bit murky in terms of assessing whether they were achieved or not, but that's not so with hostage settings. In hostage settings, the perpetrators demand things like money or prisoner releases. There's no ambiguity about whether the tactic helped or hurt in terms of gaining the concessions. And again, civilian attacks, whether we want to call it terrorism or not, impedes the odds of granting any concessions at all. Even when I do experiments, moving away from observational settings, I find the same thing, that respondents, when they believe that a aggrieved group uses terrorism by attacking civilians, is significantly less interested in negotiations. So whether we want to use the unit of analysis as the group, the campaign, down to the incident itself, or if we want to move away from observational studies to the world of experiments, I consistently find that terrorism, defined as non-state actors attacking civilian targets, doesn't pay in terms of inducing government concessions. It's not only ineffective, but it's actually counterproductive relative to alternative methods. And so the first thing that smart militant leaders do is that they recognize that terrorism is a losing strategy. Of course, it's not enough for the leader to simply snap his fingers and to have his members avoid harming civilians. Even when the leader learns the costs of terrorism, he must still prevent his fighters from doing it, which brings us to rule number 2. It's actually awfully hard for the leader to impose his tactical preferences on the rank and file, and that's because militant groups suffer from what's called a principal agent problem, where lower-level members often don't act in accordance with the leader's preferences. There are all sorts of reasons for why this is. Low-level operatives, they tend to have a worse education, less experience in combat, and they actually have stronger personal incentives for harming civilians. For example, to gain respect among their peers. Now, the key to mitigate this principal agent problem and have the leader thereby impose his tactical preferences on the rank and file is to centralize the organization. So the leader can educate fighters to avoid civilians, punish ones who harm civilians, and screen out prospective members who seem prone to attacking civilians. This chart here depicts the predicted probabilities of which militant groups will attack civilians. What you see at my far right end is essentially the smartest kind of leader. That's a leader who follows rules 1 and 2. He publicly opposes civilian attacks and centralizes the group to limit them. And when he follows both of those rules, the odds of the group attacking civilians is about 15% of the time. Now that might seem like a high likelihood of terrorism until you compare it to the other permutations. Skipping along right here is essentially the stupidest kind of leader. That's the leader who follows neither rules 1 nor 2. He publicly favors civilian attacks and decentralizes the organization, such that even if he wanted to restrain some of his members from harming civilians, he'd have a really difficult time doing so. Examples of groups like that are Islamic State, the Armed Islamic Group of Algeria, which was mentioned, the KKK at the height of its bloodletting. Now, I use a whole bunch of different methodological approaches to demonstrate how decentralization is folly. for militant leaders because it promotes leadership deficits, empowering lower-level members who are more inclined to engage in this politically suboptimal form of violence that many of us call terrorism. So what we see in this chart is that when operatives move further away from the leader, thereby decentralizing, the odds of the violence attacking civilian targets goes up. So when these are, I think, dummy variables. When you switch from a domestic to international, when the attack becomes a cross-border insurgency, the odds of the quality of the violence declining and becoming against civilians goes up. Let's see. So here's another take on the same matter. Thanks. So I looked at affiliates. Affiliates, by their very nature, are also very decentralized, right? And what I show to substantiate rule number 2 is that affiliates, because they're more decentralized from the senior leadership, are again substantially more likely to engage in terrorism by directing their violence against civilian targets. Right, so this demonstrates that. Another thing that I did was I used drone data. Now, there's been a lot of research on the use of drones, and most researchers want to know, do drones work? Right? Does it reduce the frequency of attacks? Does it reduce the lethality? But what I demonstrate based on my theory is a different effect. That when you take out the leader of the militant group, it decentralizes the group, empowering lower level members. And that's why you see a rise in the amount of terrorism. Because lower level operatives are empowered, they tend to not be as strategic. And so militant groups, when they lose their leader, they actually are more likely to engage in terrorism by attacking civilian targets. Now, there's only one kind of militant group that won't attack more civilians when the leader has been taken out, and that's the kind of leader that doesn't follow rules 1 or 2. That's when the leader already favored civilian violence and decentralized the group. Because as we saw before, the odds of that kind of group attacking civilians is already about 100% of the time. And so it's not going to get any higher. There have been many reports of Baghdadi being killed over the past several years. Only the most recent one is credible. However, with each one, journalists have called me up, all excited to ask me, what do I think the effects are going to be on ISIS? And what I've tried to explain in the 2 seconds that I speak to them is that it actually won't have a substantial impact on at least the nature of ISIS's violence, because Baghdadi didn't follow rules 1 or 2, and I'll conclude here by showing you that he also didn't follow rule number 3. Even in the BestRun group, some militants will still occasionally commit terrorism due to ignorance, personal incentives, or just bad luck. As we've seen, civilians are still struck about 15% of the time, even when the leader opposes terrorism and centralizes the group to limit it. The key is for the leader to brand the organization as moderate, even when members act otherwise. For the book, I studied the crisis management literature in business to see how executives preserve the reputation of their company when employees misbehave. For example, I looked at what the CEOs of Domino's, Taco Bell, and Burger King did when their employees did all sorts of disgusting things to the food, putting the reputation of the company at risk. And what I discovered is that smart CEOs engage in denial when their employees act in ways that risk tarnishing the reputation of the company. And so do successful militant leaders when their operatives harm civilians. I'm nearly out of time. So, for example, I looked at credit claiming. Because there's variation in terms of whether militant groups claim credit. And what I found is that militant leaders tend to be substantially less likely to claim organizational credit when the violence attacks civilian targets. 41% less likely to claim credit for those attacks. And as the leader gets smarter, essentially as the group ages and the leader gains experience and gets older, he becomes even less likely to claim civilian attacks. This final chart here compares the target selection of militant groups to the attacks featured in its extremist propaganda videos. And even some rather extreme groups like Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb and Al-Shabaab, they feature in their videos significantly less civilian violence than what their members actually carry out. By contrast, the leaders of super extreme groups like ISIS and AQI, they do the exact opposite. They claim credit for pretty much all of their violence, including when it strikes civilian targets, and they go even further, and they're stupid enough to then brag about it over social media, which only unites the world to pummel them. Thank you so much.
Thank you both. That was really, really interesting. And it's great to be here for the 25th anniversary of CSTPV. I started my CSTPV career in 2003 as a student. And Magnus was my lecturer. Paul Wilkinson was here. And I loved it so much I came back as a staff member in 2008. And at that stage, Paul retired again. I think it was 3 times he retired. And Max, of course, was there, and Alex, and then Richard came along, and worked with Tim. So it's been fantastic being here as a student and a staff member, and it's great to see the work now that's carrying on after this time. And to mention, of course, Gillian, who's probably the longest serving staff member. She's somewhere around here. But to hear the presentations and to see the work that's continuing internationally is really interesting, and you made a very good point about the young people in Molenbeek, because they really got to the heart of the issue in terrorism studies, and that's the issue of isolation, that it's not about psychology, or it's not about politics, or it's not about bigger social issues. It's about all of those things together. And while we certainly can't say that we haven't made leaps and bounds in terms of research since the 2000s, in fact, we've overcome many of the issues and the self-criticism that really wrecked the field in those early days. What we haven't done, like many other disciplines, is we haven't tackled that interdisciplinarity in any meaningful way. And that's not just an issue for terrorism studies, that is really an issue across the board. So I'm a psychologist. I worked with Max Max was my lecturer, rather than work with him in UCC in Cork in Ireland. And being a psychologist, I see the world as a series of psychological problems. But of course, not everything is a psychological problem, and terrorism isn't a psychological problem. It's many, many things. And that comes back again to this idea of disciplinary isolation and how we should think about terrorism. And Martha brought that point up again, that context is key. That ideology is important, that psychology is important, that context is putting everything in context is the only way we can possibly understand what's actually going on. And made the point, of course, that the ideological appeal of ISIS, of Al-Qaeda, it only succeeds because those receiving the message, those on the receiving end of the ideology, they can interpret that. They can reuse that based on their own experience. And really importantly, meaning-making happens at a local level. And that's how the power and the strength of these ideas grow. But the connectivity and the interconnectivity outside of the individual is the strength of it. I think another really important point that came up was the issue of language and the focus on dichotomy, the idea that there's a physical battle in the theatre of war, it's a civil war, any kind of conflict, but that we might equate that with a battle of ideas, or a battle of positions, or a battle of ideologies, and that as if that can ever be a zero-sum thing. And I think we get lost in that sometimes. And again, a key point being that terrorism is a complex social phenomenon, it's a complex political phenomenon. Things are messy. We have to be happy with the grey. We're dealing in unknowns, and linearity is just not a reality. And I think Max picked up on some of those points really well, and some of the same themes came up. And again, the importance of the individual came through in his presentation, and the importance of the individual in context. But in this case, the context was the group, and the group dynamics, particularly around leadership. And in both papers, I think a key point that I took from it was messaging. Whether it's messaging around leadership, messaging around the control of the organization, messaging in terms of counter-radicalization and government propaganda. those are key elements that we need to consider, whether it's the behavior of the group or the control of a conflict. And so despite the different focuses of both the papers, I think what both authors did very successfully was problematize the notion of success. Particularly any bounded notion of success that takes the events out of context. And I suppose just very quickly, I would like to ask the speakers just if they could comment on how we should think about success when we're not concerned so much with military dominance and territorial claims or losses, but when ideology is the root of longevity and when ideology is key to the continuation of conflict. What does success look like then for a terrorist organization? Go ahead. Thanks.
Thank you. Would you like to respond?
Sure, and then I'll turn it over to Max. This is a really fraught question. I've dealt with it myself previously in a chapter I wrote on the effectiveness of terrorism in the Algerian War, because the FLN also is frequently cited as successful. And I think, just putting it very briefly, that I think success in whose perspective? In their perspective, and our perspective, and someone else's perspective. If their perspective, we're looking at what would they regard as successful, then we have to know what they wanted, and we struggle to know what that is.
Yeah, in the book, what I look at is what are the best tactics available to aggrieved groups for achieving their stated political goals. That's my main dependent variable. Secondarily, I look at membership size. What's the best tactic to use to increase membership size? And whether we're looking at the strategic goal in terms of government concessions or organizational goal in terms of membership size, I consistently find that civilian targeting in general is counterproductive. However, I want to be clear, some people misunderstand me and they think what I'm arguing is that terrorists must be irrational, right? But there's a difference between doing something that's not strategic as we understand it versus doing something that's completely irrational. For something to be irrational, there would need to be no benefit in any sense at all in terms of what the actor prioritizes. And I would never go so far as to make that claim. I think that very often terrorism doesn't pay politically, and in that sense it's not strategic, but it is rational at the individual level, right? For somebody, for example, who is really pissed off because his family was, say, bombed by, say, the Israelis. And now he wants to attack an Egged bus in Jerusalem. And for a moment, that will give him, a good feeling maybe. There can be good feeling, there can be utility in vengeance, right? Even if then Israel were to subsequently respond by tightening the screws on Gaza. So just because something is strategic doesn't necessarily mean it's irrational. I do think that terrorism is not strategic in the ways that I've defined it, but it can confer numerous benefits to individuals, and for that reason, we're going to see it persist. And counterterrorism needs to be very clever about trying to identify what are these different ways that terrorists are deriving utility from their behavior, because that could help us to eliminate these forms of utility, which is essential for deterrence.
Thank you.